This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is a biomedical engineering professor at both Harvard and MIT. He has started 12 companies. Very interesting technology. His companies have developed technologies that can seal holes inside a beating heart, a nasal spray that neutralizes pathogens, smart needles that can automatically stop when they reach their target. This is some very serious homework. But he has taken all of his experiences and reduced them to an understanding, a playbook, so to speak, that we can all learn from. He calls these life ignition tools, the idea being to use nature's playbook to energize your brain, spark ideas, and ignite action. We all need that. I'm pretty good at it, but I need the reminders. I need new ideas. I'm not afraid of learning something new. So without any further setup for me, no more delays, let's jump right into my guest today, Jeff Karp, and discuss life ignition tools. I hope you enjoy. When I look at your bio, I think you're my first in a decade plus of doing a podcast, my first biomedical engineering professor at Harvard, at MIT. People listening are probably going to be thinking you might get a kick out of where I'm going to go with this initial intro, but people might be hearing that initially thinking, oof, that's past my pay grade. But here I am making notes to myself about you as a young man, attention span problems, anxious kid, called a troublemaker. One teacher, as you were trying to help another kid with math, one teacher said, blind leading the blind. I saw the quote also, a lazy con artist. I'm going to want to hear more about that. So here's the reason I set all this up. I lay out this where you are now, which is pretty prominent. And I lay out this early history because it got me thinking, man. I did 12 years of Catholic school. And I remember we had this one sister in first grade. And then by the time I got to sixth grade, there was another sister. And I must have done something wrong in sixth grade. So the one in sixth grade sent me back to first grade for the day, right? You know, this is, I guess, crazy punishments that exist back in the day. And I remember walking back in. It was the same teacher that I'd not really seen for 6 years. And I walked in and she just looked at me, this, kind of rotund nun. And she looked at me and she said, I always knew you'd be back, Covel. And here I am in my 50s now, and I can remember this kind of a story. And maybe a lot of people have these kinds of stories. It makes you really question a lot of the educational process. Now, look, there are great teachers, great professors out there, but there's some that are not. With that grand setup, let's take you back to the troublemaker. I was called a troublemaker. I mean, maybe you could already detect that in my voice, but I think it's probably difficult for people to understand how you can go from being called a troublemaker, a kid with bad grades, I think, which is a true statement about you at a certain point in your life, to where you are now. We could probably stay there for an hour just on how we got to there, but that's a really interesting transition. Take me back to that time, those early times, and share some of the feeling that you must have had. And there was one moment, I think it was a teacher that got you to think about the how, a big question that really got you started down your path. Share with me some. How do you feel when I share my story?
Thanks for sharing that. I definitely feel some resonance there. When I was back in the second grade, I had ADHD and learning differences, but I didn't know it, and my parents didn't know it. My teachers certainly didn't know it. And boy, did I struggle because of it. I would basically just be sitting at the back of the classroom in second grade, not understanding anything. My mom tried cue cards and phonics and nothing worked. I didn't understand anything. I felt like a complete alien, just not fitting in. I wasn't fitting in socially. And when the end of the year came around, the teacher pulled my parents aside and said, hey, I think we should hold Jeff back a year to repeat the second grade. And my parents negotiated with the teacher so that if I spent the summer trying to catch up with tutors and such, that I could move ahead. And so I started going in and seeing these tutors. And one day I'll never forget, I went in and the tutor asked me a question. I forget what that question was, but then she asked me a second question. I forget exactly the context or whatever, but it was something that she had read to me and she asked me a question about it. And then I just gave an answer. And she said, "How did you think about that?" So she wanted to kind of get in deep in terms of how did I formulate that response. I kind of stopped in my tracks because no one had asked me that question before. All of a sudden, I was like, wait a moment, I can think about what I am going to say before I say it. I have like a direct line to my thinking. And that sort of this canvas kind of unfolded in my mind that just opened up this completely new opportunity for being able to think about how I'm thinking, to try to plan more before I said, I was just a very impulsive kid and I just said anything that came to my mind and just did anything. That's what life was all about. And so being able to sort of have a window into the inner workings of my mind, it just had a major impact on me and was really the beginning of what brought me to Lit, which is this book that I've been working on the last 7 years.
Yeah, I don't recall a teacher ever asking me something like that because essentially what they're asking, I mean, they're asking not only for your opinion, but how you are contemplating, how you are thinking about something, how you are cogitating about something. And that seems very unusual for me if I think back to teachers and professors, because generally it was like, hey, I'm talking to you, you just listen. So it is very interesting question to hear it as a young person. Let me also push a little bit more on you're having, as you describe, a problem with attention span at that time. Is this something, this is kind of a tangent question, but it does seem like that the little girls get through school a lot easier than the little boys, generally speaking. That I think little girls are going to be like, hey, what are the rules? Okay, I'll follow the rules. And if you have a lot of lady teachers, okay. But then if you get some growing boys and whatnot, things become a little bit different. I've always thought about that, but you get older and you're like, well, I guess the system keeps marching on, and you wonder, do a lot of little boys fall through the cracks?
Yeah, I think they do. And I was headed in that direction if it wasn't for my parents, in particular, my mom. You mentioned a bunch of the things that my teachers were saying about me as I was going through. And without the sort of context or this environment of support, this can destroy a child and really inhibit their ability to unleash their potential. Luckily, I had my parents in the background basically just telling me that I shouldn't be defined by what my teachers call me or say about me or my grades. I mean, I was getting C's and D's up until the seventh grade, which is when I got identified. My mom went into the school trying to figure out how I could get identified with learning differences, and the school just didn't have the resources to do it. So they refused. And so my mom literally went and prepared this massive file and went to the Board of Education herself to present the case. That's when I got identified. And that's when I got some extra, like some accommodation. So I needed some extra time, a little extra space. But by that time, I had already been developing tools. Like if I go back to the second grade, it really, kind of knowing what I know now about the brain and how things work, it was like I unlocked the ability to leverage and harness my neuroplasticity.
You didn't know that term at that age, though.
No, I definitely didn't know
Yeah.
the term at that age for sure. But it was many, many, many years later. But neuroplasticity is really at the heart of evolution. It's really our ability to interact with our environment and adapt and respond to it. It's the ability essentially where the connections in our brain can be remodeled based on things that we say, like even this conversation right now, or anyone listening, or it's like anything you do in your life, your brain is constantly responding to how you're interacting with your environment. And so new connections are formed, old connections are being removed, and some existing connections are being strengthened. It was almost like I had a direct line into that. And so I began to explore different ways that I could develop like coping strategies, which ended up being tools, which all of them I use today as well.
Before we bring us up to current time, I want to keep it at one more curious question about your mom. When she went to bat for you, so to speak, went to the school board, etc., was she working with instinct and intuition, or did she have some other measures of your abilities like IQ to go to bat for you? What did she know? Or was it just motherly gut instinct?
I think a lot of it was motherly gut instinct, really. I even remember when I was doing this with these tutors and they did an IQ test on me. And one of the parts of the IQ test, they have this almost like a storyboard, but it's broken up into these cards. And then they ask you to put them in order. And one of the things that I just really struggled with and still struggle with today is that I don't see just like one possibility. I see many possibilities for things. And to me, it's really hard to figure out, when a teacher's, let's say, asking a student to give an answer, I don't know which answer is the highest priority answer to give. And so when I was presented with these kind of cards, I just saw many different ways to put it together. So I don't think I ever did well on an IQ test.
I just relate so much to your path, even though I've gone a different path. I never got above a C or an English in college, and I've written 8 books on a particular quant trading strategy. I think back to failing calculus my first semester of college and then getting a different teacher and all of a sudden getting A's in it. The way you describe your up and down nature and the way you describe makes me relate, because in many ways I look back and I'm like, almost nothing I've done in my adult life is connected to, I mean, of course, I had to learn the basics, but I don't remember any teachers that really influenced me. It seemed like my curiosity, even though I wasn't in the academic system, as I'm in my 20s, I was curious. And so I was going down this path of digging and finding my own way and ended up writing books that some people might say, or at least one of them is like a textbook. So it is really interesting to hear your story. And then it makes me think about my story. And then it makes me think about all these other people listening are probably thinking, gosh, that sounds like something that I went through too. It's unfortunate, but in a flip side, maybe people like you, people like me, other people listening, maybe we need this push, this something that wakes us up that's different than just the typical kid that just sits there and memorizes everything and maybe just takes a job for the man and doesn't really pursue a life of creativity or novel invention or whatnot.
I don't think we were designed to be subjected to formalized education. If we go back, let's say 12,000, 15,000 years ago, when we were all hunters and gatherers living in various villages, I think that our education was experiential. I mean, we were learning with everybody, but we were outside, we were working, we were helping. Children's opinions mattered more. I think everyone felt needed. One of the people that I interviewed for the book, Elder David Corchine, who started this Turtle Lodge in Manitoba in Canada, and just so many incredible stories around that. If we contrast, let's say, 10,000, 20,000 years ago and sort of how things are today in terms of the education, it's just incredible, like how we got here.
Let me give you a jumping off place that bring people into your world. I can relate this as well. So I work out every day. I'm in my 50s, but I work out every day and I work out pretty intensely. And I've talked a lot about this on this podcast, probably more intensely than a lot of guys in their 20s. But movement, I know, and the word I might use is hack. You might use a different word and I'll let you explain. But I know movement is key to my ability to create, to my ability to imagine, to my ability to think. And if I don't have movement, if I don't have the workouts, I'm nothing. Like I have to have this.
This is one of the tools that I kind of stumbled on when I was younger. And again, it was like struggling in school C's and D's, and I needed to find ways to cope and to survive. And one of the things that I found along the way is when I moved, it leads to, flood your brain with all these positive neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, oxytocin. There's so many of them. Let's say when in exercise, we do it so we look good, or we did it so that we build muscle. But what I realize now is that it goes way beyond that. And potentially more importantly, when we move, it actually has this domino effect in everything in our lives. One of the things that I've just been constantly up against is finding ways to intercept these routine patterns that I get stuck in and trying to innovate, trying to find ways to break through and create new patterns and new habits. And I can't do that unless I feel good, unless I make movement a big priority in my day.
Oh, I'm sure, given that you just said that, because I can relate 1,000,000%. If you wake up and maybe you didn't get the right amount of sleep, or you went to bed too late or whatever, or you just wake up maybe feeling a little something. Every time that happens to me, I've got to go sweat. I've got to go sweat because I already know if I wake up in that condition or if I feel at any point in time I'm in that condition and I still want to be productive that day, I need to stop trying to be productive in like some kind of sit at the desk manner. And I need to get my butt out and go sweat. And then if I do that and I come back, then I've got a chance at least to be productive for that day. But if I don't go do the exercise, if I don't go do the movement, forget it.
There's a lot of regions in our brain that are connected and so influenced by what we do during our day in terms of if we're getting the right amount of sleep or what we're eating or a level of movement. For example, our prefrontal cortex is involved in decision making, thinking, and attention. And it's linked to other regions of the brain. I mean, many regions of the brain, but a couple in particular, like the amygdala. And the amygdala is where we kind of have this fight or flight response. And that's activated all the time in our digital world, right? We're constantly on high alert. So it's like our digital world is almost like taking advantage of this sort of these survival instincts that we have. And so now we're kind of stressed constantly throughout our day. But we know that if we go and exercise, we can actually shift that. We can shift from what's called the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system, which actually is a calming effect. It actually will calm us down. So in other words, if we make exercise part of our regular routine, if we prioritize it, we can actually flip the switch to be calmer during the day, but also increase our ability to learn, to be able to recognize patterns, to be able to program and reprogram our brains on a consistent basis. We have better ability for remembering things, recalling things. It's like, it just goes on and on.
I also love, and it's kind of a corollary to where we just went with what I'm calling a hack, but this idea of repetition and incremental improvement. I mentioned exercise. I brought up exercise. And one of the things that I have started doing the last couple of years is box jumping. And I sometimes share with friends and family that, okay, what's my progress? And they're probably thinking, well, why is this guy interested in this? Why is he's in his 50s? Why is he worried about how much higher he can jump? Why is he keeping track of this? I sometimes feel like this because no one seems to participate with me except this one lady that I work out with. We both compete with each other, but no one seems to participate with the curiosity part of like, why? And now you give me an explanation for why. I mean, I'm enjoying the feeling of the incremental improvement. I'm enjoying the repetition, but I didn't really have the phraseology to describe why I'm doing it. It's just interesting to observe other people observing me. I think they just kind of look at me like I'm a nut. I'm going to break my back or break my neck or something like that. Whereas then I look at your work and I'm like, okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for giving me an explanation as to why I'm behaving how I'm behaving.
There are so many things that we can do in our lives to bring in that fresh energy, to energize not just our minds, but our whole beings. And I think that one of the things that you said about this incremental progress and getting in touch with it, it's something that I got in touch with very early in life because as I was struggling in school getting C's and D's, my mom on her side of the family, they used to do these speech competitions. And I think in the fourth grade, when we had our first speech competition at my school, and she wrote this speech for me and said, we need you to memorize this speech. My memory was never great. I always felt like I had a terrible memory, but she coached me. That was actually when I truly started to fall in love with practice because what happened was she would send me to my room and I would have to try to, and I couldn't put a sentence together, but a few words, like all of a sudden I could remember a few words. And I was like, huh. And then it was a sentence, and then it was two sentences, and it was three sentences. I would practice in front of her without the speech, and eventually I could get a paragraph. And I tuned into that incremental progress. Like when you are able to tune into that, you actually feel something. It's not this huge thing, but you can actually feel it. It's this visceral sort of whole body feeling. To me, that's what's so important about developing new skills is that we need to find ways to fall in love with practice. We need to find ways to fall in love with that incremental, nuanced sort of, that felt, like, oh, wow, kind of proud of yourself feeling. And that is what I think really helps us to kind of keep going in anything that we want to do in life.
Yeah, I should share. I mentioned at the top that I'm about 8,000 miles away from you. I'm in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Never expected to be here a decade ago, but here I am. And a lot of that was surprise. And secondarily, perhaps my favorite word in the English language, serendipity. Clearly a word very important to you as well. But it's amazing that if you allow yourself to be surprised and you allow yourself to go somewhere or do something that you're not expecting, and you just, instead of sitting on the couch and saying, I already know what it's going to be, or I know it's going to be there. But if you just do it, and I'm not saying I'm perfect at this, but if you just do it, it's amazing that how surprise can lead to serendipity.
Yes. One of the sort of tools that I use to do it, as you kind of say, is when I was in chemistry class many, many years ago, there was this concept that was presented called activation energy. Let's say if you just put two molecules into a beaker of water and nothing happens, and you add a little bit of heat to it and things start moving around a little bit, but nothing happens. You add more heat, then all of a sudden these molecules bombard and they connect together, but there's actually a reaction that occurs. The amount of heat that you put in there is the activation energy, the amount of energy to cause a reaction. And when I heard that, I was like, wait a moment, I think I can apply this to everything in my life. And so I started thinking about anything that I wanted to do and what's the amount of energy that I needed to put into it. And if that energy was too big, which it is for most things that I want to do, I start thinking, okay, are there ways that I can reduce the activation energy? Are there things that I can do, these sort of initial steps that I can take that will then make the activation energy more sort of tangible? It's almost like you kind of think of like a ball that's you're pushing it up the hill and then it starts rolling down the other side. You just have to get it to the top of the hill. So I'll give you just a quick example of something that happened this past summer. A friend of mine called me when he was riding his bike and he's like, Jeff, riding my bike is my happy place. And I was like, oh my God, me too. And then it struck me, wait, why am I not biking? I've had a bike in my garage for years and I'm never using it. And so I thought to myself, okay, well, if I just go and say, I'm going to get on my bike later today, I'm just setting myself up for shaming myself. It's not going to happen, because I think what happens is people set goals that are too grandiose, they're too big, and then you actually practice not achieving your goals. And so I think what we need to do is practice achieving goals. And how we do that is we lower the activation energy. And those steps to lower the activation energy actually can be a very positive thing, that it is like we're actually encouraging ourselves to go take that one key step that we need to get, let's say in my case, on a bike. So what I did was one day I said, okay, I'm just going to clean up my bike. So that's all. I wouldn't let myself do anything else. And then the next day I'm just going to put air in the tires. And then the next day I put the helmet, just hung it on the handlebar, went and found it, cleaned it up. And then I put the bike somewhere where I would see it every day. And now I had lowered the activation energy to the point where the next step was literally all I had to do was find 15 minutes to get on the bike and go around my neighborhood. And so I found the 15 minutes, and this past summer, I biked over 1,000 miles.
It's amazing that if you just sit down and think of these practical ways to get started, which you've done, which you are giving us all a chance to dive into your homework, so to speak, and maybe get there faster than figuring it out on our own. It's amazing how much we can do. And they hear the kind of ideas that you're talking about, whether it's exercise, all these different things to kind of like, quote, get started. I think people get concerned, or they incorrectly think that I'm going to lose time doing that. So they're thinking, I've got this big thing over here that I want to do. But they're thinking, well, you're telling me I now I've got to do these things over here that seems to be, in their mind, seems to be not connected to their big idea, their big project or whatever. And so I think people don't want to put the time in, whereas they're not seeing that if they put the time in on the thing that looks like it's not connected to their big project, they might actually get even more productive on the big project instead of just wasting time not getting the big project done. Am I phrasing that in a way that makes sense?
Absolutely. You're bringing up a story that a friend told me in the summer. Tell me if you think that this connects. I just jumped into my mind, but he was saying that he was on this paint job. There was another painter, it was just him and another painter, and they were independently hired to paint his house. He got everything together, brought the ladder over, and he brought all the paints, and he just sort of like organized everything, but everything he needed was there. But it took him a lot of time to actually get everything organized. And then finally he was ready and all there, and he started to paint the house, and he sort of watched what the other guy was doing. And the other guy, what he did is he just sort of brought over the ladder and like one thing of paint, and he just started going. But then he realized that he had forgotten something. And so then he went back and got that thing. And so By the time half the day had happened, my friend Josh had painted way more of the house than this other guy because he would just kept going back and forth, like kind of in this disorganized thing. And so I think this idea that if we just take that time to think about it and plan, visualize what we're going to need, then at the end of the day, we're actually going to save time. We're going to be more efficient. We're going to have more time for all these other things that we really want to prioritize in our life.
This also opens up another more complicated issue. I'll let you explain. I have an example I might want to bring up too. The more we become more expert in whatever it is that we're doing, something happens also to our brain. And I think the MRIs explain it well. Whereas if somebody might be new to something, whatever it might be, and I'm thinking of Patrick Mahomes just winning the Super Bowl, that guy looked like he was in slow motion. He was clearly in a completely different headspace than so many other people on the field. Because for him, I'm sure at this stage of his career, having now won 3 Super Bowls, he's able to kind of bring the intensity inside his mind down. Whereas if somebody, new or whatnot, their brains can be firing in all cylinders and they might not be able to keep calm, et cetera. Explain what I'm talking about in a more detailed fashion and share with people too the MRI part of this and the ability to analyze.
Absolutely. One of the concepts that I use all the time, I refer to as the low energy brain state. I sort of use it because it's how I feel when I'm in the state or when I'm gravitating towards it. And for me, I feel like it's almost like this ground state where it's like that's the autopilot. For example, get in my car and I could drive somewhere and not even really think about where I need to turn or anything. My mind can be in some other place. In fact, when I arrive, I forget the route I took because it's just been programmed into me. And I feel like that's something that is both a problem, but also can be an asset in our lives, this low energy brain state. It's a problem because we get trapped in patterns that don't serve us. For example, you eat a meal, you get to the end of it and you're like shocked that, wait a moment, you don't remember any flavors and you can't believe that you're already done. Or you read, for example, a page on a book, you can't even recall anything that you read because your mind has just been on this sort of like autopilot mode, it's somewhere else. There's so many examples where our brains kind of go. It's like when we learn a new skill, let's say you learn a new skill, you program it in, then your brain doesn't need to put in as much effort next time because now it's sort of like imprinted in your memory. It's all there.
Less mental energy as well too, right?
Less than exactly. So I interviewed Chris Hadfield, who's an astronaut. He directed the International Space Station, and I interviewed him for this book. He said when he was preparing to go into space, he ended up doing a number of spacewalks. And he said that he had to practice every possible thing that they could consider that might go wrong, that he practiced that on Earth so that he wouldn't have to think when he was in space, so he could direct all of his thinking energy towards the things that he couldn't prepare for. I feel like it's that type of a thing where when we are learning a skill or when we're, doing things in our lives, and patterns are very important in terms of if you're playing, let's say like a musical instrument, or when you start doing something initially, you have to kind of put yourself into this higher energy brain state to get familiar with what's new. You're sort of forging new neural connections. And then as those are being formed, you're strengthening them over and over again. And then your brain doesn't need as much energy, doesn't need as much sort of activation to then just replay and follow along those pathways. But when you do something new, you're actually creating new pathways. And so that takes a lot more energy. Sleep is very important as well when you're learning new things. One final thing that I'll say on this topic, which to me was just so fascinating, is someone else that I interviewed is Molly Gebrian, who's a neuroscientist and a violin player. And in her research, what she found is that it's actually in between the practice that is when we do the learning. That's when mind turns into matter. And she was saying that it's just so important that, let's say if you have an hour to practice something, you don't just practice for that full hour. You actually want to break it up and have these breaks because it's in the pauses, it's in the breaks when your brain is actually changing physically. And I mean, when we sleep, it's the same thing. That's when all of these connections are being formed and fortified and strengthened, and it becomes very important for a lot of things we do during our day.
Let me share an example. You've got me thinking about something that happened to me just the other day. So I've been doing this podcast for a long time, hundreds of interviews. I don't like 8 Nobel Prize winners. I talk to a lot of people. So I have a sense of having conversations with people and doing interviews. But back in a past life, in my early 20s, I was in London. I was studying international relations, had a chance to meet a lot of interesting people, and I got a feel for how complicated a place like Europe is and how different that a place like Europe is compared to America, especially the politics and the individual nation states across Europe. It's very, quote, territorial. It's very different than America. And so the other day, and I don't say this to be political, but the other day, the big conversation that many people around the world were talking about was Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin in Moscow. And so I was in a group of people online and they were discussing this and they had their views about how the questions went and how the answers went. And I looked at it completely different because I knew these very smart people that I was interacting with, but they didn't really have the experience with knowing how interviews can unfold, knowing something about how international relations in Europe works. And so they were fixated on topics, and I can almost feel their minds working because they wanted to know, but they were kind of going down the wrong path just because they had not really been exposed to that information. Whereas I just felt kind of very calm about what I knew. Now, I didn't know for sure that I was right, but from an uncertainty perspective, I was looking at the probabilities in my mind and I'm thinking, hold on, the probabilities are going to be on my side just based on what I've been exposed to in life. I might not be right, but I know what the probabilities are probably going to be on my side. But this is a very difficult thing when you have people that have wildly different experiences like me. I mean, I would have to defer to you on so many topics, right? That doesn't make me feel negative or doesn't make me feel less than. It's just we all go down paths in life. This is an interesting issue, though, in the modern world, trying to find some commonality. But your work just gets me thinking about all of these things because the way that you frame these topics in your book, Lit, it's for everyone, frankly, to get us all thinking about how to better navigate each day.
Listen, I think we're all on a spectrum. There's this neurodiversity, right? We all have had different experiences. We all have different wiring. We all have different genetics. We're all interacting with our environment in slightly different ways, some more extreme than others. And I think that if we were all the same, life would be pretty boring and we wouldn't need our curiosities as much. And I think that to me, one of the most powerful forces that we can tap into is our curiosity. And I think we can actually get better at it. And I found through my experience, there's almost nothing better than finding a way to lead with your curiosity. And so when people are expressing certain opinions or they're telling stories or sharing something, just asking questions and really just trying to genuinely learn and be interested. And actually remind me of a story back when I entered grad school. This is at University of Toronto, where I was doing my PhD, and I started to attend these seminars to get to the end of the seminars and people ask questions, professors and students. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, wait a moment, why am I not thinking of these questions? Like, what is wrong with me? I started to shame myself. But by that time, because I had struggled so much, but at the same time, I was trying to develop tools to be able to cope and thrive. I thought, okay, if I'm not good at something, the reason is not because I'm inherently not good at it, but because I just haven't found the right process to engage that works for me. And so what I did was I sort of started to think, okay, well, how can I figure out a way to ask better questions? Because if I could do that, that would be sort of a portal into reading more with my curiosity and being able to be more engaged in these seminars. And so what I did was I just came up with this idea that I would write down the questions after the end of each seminar. And so after a few months, I had pages and pages of questions. And then I started one day, I just started looking through them and I was like, oh my God, there's patterns to these questions. So I was able to group the questions into 4 or 5 kind of key categories, which then gave me insights into why people were asking the questions. Some were about whether what the person was doing, what was their sort of experimental system, was it working? Another was, are their results actually important? Like if they're trying to develop a diagnostic test and their results look incredible, but they did everything in salt water versus in blood, maybe the results aren't important yet. They haven't done that key important step. So I started to realize that. And then when I started going to seminars, I was able to then follow along more. I was more engaged. And by the end, I had like a whole list of questions that I wanted to ask at the end of these seminars. And I sort of realized it was a skill that I could get better at. But that also piqued my curiosity. It kept me more engaged during the seminars. It also, I think, led to more creativity because I started to link things that they were saying to other things that I know. To me, it's just one of these ways that we can interact with other people. You can do this social settings as well, like just trying to write down or text yourself whatever certain questions that you see people ask each other. And we can sort of reflect on them later on and start to get a better sense of the questions we might be able to lead with. And when we're truly curious about other people, that's when we start to form these deep connections.
So there's a few words here in your world that are also in my world. As I mentioned, having written many books about a particular quant trading strategy, and that quant trading strategy is very opportunistic and it doesn't predict anything. It just says, hey, what market is moving? Where is the momentum? And I will follow along momentum until it stops, until I get a quote exit. This is in your world too. So I find this amazing where here you are, you're talking about ways to boost momentum. You're talking about being opportunistic, right? And you're talking about not being afraid to fail. These are like all the things that you would put on the list of great quote trading or venture capital. Or so many things out there. For example, the owner of the Boston Red Sox made all of his money trading the way that I describe. And it's exactly the same terminology you're using, except you're applying the terminology in a different walk of life. And I find this whole being open to whatever might happen. And then if something starts to happen, to put the pedal to the metal, go with the momentum, don't question it, don't argue with it, take it as long as it will ride. But when things stop, or if things go the wrong way when the momentum starts and you fail, well, so what? Get back on the horse.
Failure is something that I would say I've become a lot more comfortable with through my life because it's such a big thing in what I do. I'm a biomedical engineer. I run a research laboratory. And in my laboratory, it's not just about publishing papers in academic journals and moving on. What we try to do is to take those academic discoveries and then turn them into technologies that can be tested in clinical trials and eventually help, hopefully, millions and millions of people. When we do that in academia, there's a lot of failure that we encounter on a daily basis. But then when you try to take that science and turn it into a product, we encounter even more failure. There's been so many things in my life where I have encountered failure. And so I needed to develop a process for dealing with that failure, not just dealing with it, but actually using it to create momentum. And I love that word momentum. I have a few of these simple mantras that I use all the time. And one of them is maximize momentum. Maybe I'll step back and say, I think that in the education system, we sort of learn failures to the left and successes to the right, and you want to avoid the failure and maximize success. In my experience, I've realized that failure is a prerequisite to obtaining success. And in fact, it's one of the places where we can gain the greatest insights and opportunities for growth. It was almost by necessity because I was failing so much as a child. And in all of these things that I did, I needed to focus on what are the insights that I can gain from every single situation so I can improve my efficiency. I can better understand what to say, what not to say, or how to do a certain math problem, whatever it is. But there's been so many challenges. Just to kind of share here is at one point I was invited to go speak at TEDMed. I initially said no because I had this fear and hesitation, but then I kind of got myself together because I was like, oh, I'm probably never going to be asked again. And this is such an incredible opportunity. But those talks, generally you memorize like a 15-minute talk. I went back, I said, hey, I really want to do this. So I wrote out what I wanted to say, iterated that many, many, many times over and over and over again. Then I put some slides together and it ended up being months and months of work to put this whole thing together. I rented out Kresge Auditorium, which is the biggest auditorium at MIT. And I practiced there and I just practiced in front of as many people as I could. So I get to TEDMed and it's at the Kennedy Center in DC, sort of the speaker's night before, whatever. And they say, by the way, here's the clicker. You can't go backwards. They said, you can't go backwards with this. If you want to go back, you have to yell to the AV person behind the stage to go back a slide. And I was like, okay, there's no way I'm doing that. The anxiety is building, the fear is sort of setting in. And then they said, oh, and by the way, people in the past, if they forget their lines, they've either run off the stage or started crying. And they said, don't do that. They said, just stand there and smile.
But these are some of the smartest people in the world who don't have some of the basics of something like the public speaking down in any way. If they're going to run off the stage or cry, go ahead. There's a contrast there.
There is definitely a contrast there. And the fact that there's no teleprompters or anything, I mean, people don't typically need to memorize things like 15 or 20-minute talk to watch to do that. So like going into it, people are quite nervous. Before, I think I had like the pack of halls. I was just so nervous and I was trying to get myself together. So I get up on stage, things seem to be going well. And kind of going back to what we talked about before, I knew the talk so well. I'd practiced it so many times that I could be thinking about other things as I was giving the talk because it was just on autopilot. But then something terrible happened. Oh my God, I missed a line. What do I do? All of a sudden, I froze on the stage for 15 seconds in front of 5 high definition cameras on me, live streaming around the world, a room full of people at the Kennedy Center in DC. And here I am, 15 seconds. I'm like, oh my God, all these swear words, of course, running through my head. Okay, can't run off the stage, can't start crying. I got to smile. So I'm just smiling and my hands sort of like moving. I'm trying to use it like a lightning rod to energize my brain somehow to figure out what to say next. And then I'm like, okay, change the slide. I don't know how I came up with that. Change the slide. There's a blank slide. And I was like, oh my God, what's that? Okay, change it again. All of a sudden, the next picture shows up, which I think is a porcupine. And I'm like, wait a moment. I needed the blank slide as a cue. And I was like, okay, but I know the words associated with it. Just go, go, go. And so I just started again where I had left off. I got to the end of my talk. And as I was leaving the stage manager said, Jeff, we can totally edit that part out. What a roller coaster experience for me. I mean, there was months and months of preparation. I got up in the most spectacular way. I failed in front of this audience, the streaming, everything. But what happened next was remarkable for me, which is the fact I was able to recover. It made me more comfortable in every talk I've given since then. And so there was this moment of failure, which then was quickly, I was able to tap into some of these insights that I gained from this sort of like positive things that I got out of it. And by failing, it actually improved my ability to give presentations. So many of these failure moments I could give you, like during the first 2.5 years of my professorship, where almost every grant I wrote, and I wrote over 100 grants, got rejected, how I didn't get into medical school, how I bombed a biology exam my first year at McGill. There's so many times when that happened, but I was able to gain insights and then keep growing. And it sounds like your sort of strategy is also similar. When something's not working out, you're learning about it. And then the next time you go at it, you're better because of it.
I'll share a public speaking one too. I started public speaking at age, 19 or so. And this was like a city council stuff. But then my 30s, late 30s, maybe first book came out and I started doing presentations, large funds or auditoriums or whatever, and a lot of different types of groups, but never really that big. But I remember it was a building process. Like each time I did one of these, and it was like a couple a year, each time I knew I was getting better. I knew I was getting better. I knew I was getting more comfortable every time. And eventually I'd have some slides perhaps, but there were no notes or anything. And I couldn't do the same speech over, but I got to the point where it's like very easy to go on stage and whatnot. So I'm doing this for a long time. Then finally I get an invite to come speak in Beijing. And so I go, and I didn't really know what I was walking into. And it was an auditorium full of 1,000 people. They were going to do this kind of presentation, which I'd done before. So this wasn't completely novel to me, where I speak for 30 seconds in English and then someone translates for 30 seconds into Chinese. It's not the greatest situation, but okay. Here I am. I'm doing this presentation in front of 1,000 people. Like the energy of 1,000 people is really crazy. Most people have not had a chance to experience that. But when you're having to present to all those people, it's interesting. And so at some point, the crowd got restless while I'm talking, and like restless to the point of making noises. And like, I'm like, what? I've never had this happen before. And of course, we've got language barriers. Okay, so what happened? The audience got upset that the translator wasn't any good. And so the audience was, some people knew enough English and enough Chinese that they knew the translator wasn't any good. So essentially, the audience voted down the translator. They pulled some guy out of the audience who declared he could do it better, and he became the translator midstream. At that moment, as I'd had a decade plus of different experiences, I don't remember sweating at all. I remember thinking to myself, this is wild. This is so cool. What a crazy story. This is never going to happen to me again, I'm sure. But I remember thinking if I would have just been thrown into it as like a first presentation, oh my God, I'm sure I would have been beating sweat, you know?
There's so many thoughts going through my mind about that story. One in particular is sort of tuning into the cues, right? We're constantly getting these cues from our minds, our bodies. Our bodies are super intelligent, from other people. I think that the more that we engage in a particular activity, the more we can actually step back and observe and really have a sense of like not necessarily reacting like it was our first time that you mentioned. I'm constantly trying to read the audience as well as I'm speaking to get a sense for, are people engaged? But at the same time, I know that some people have certain look on their face. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not engaged.
Exactly. You can't read that, right?
Can't. I'm like looking for these reactions, but now I'm saying to myself, just ignore it. It's okay. It doesn't mean anything.
That's a huge hack right there, though. It doesn't mean anything. I think sometimes there's so many friends and whatnot, and you listen to them again, maybe they're trying to tackle an issue that I tackle, but maybe I tackle it in a different way. And I see sometimes they put a lot more thought into the issue than I put into it. And I just know that's not because I'm all that. It's just because I got scars on my back.
Yeah, I found in my life one thing that I use all the time that I think connects with what we're talking about. I call press pause. It's a tool to help us slow down, to be open to intuitive cues. These cues are coming from all over, and then to also be able to take time to process information and experiences. And I think one of the things that happens in our busy digital lives these days is we book meetings back to back and they're just constantly really busy, but we're not taking time in between to process what we just experienced, to be able to calibrate it, see where does it fit into the grander picture of our lives and our priorities. And I found that the more time now that I've prioritized to press pause and have time in between meetings or time at the end of the day where I can just process what's going on, what happened last week, the meeting I just had, just kind of let things kind of sink in. This can really help to contribute to the things that we're talking about. This idea to be more of the observer, to be able to not react as fast, to be able to have that pause in between stimuli and reaction. This idea of just finding ways to slow down and have time to process information and experiences is just so important.
The book, Lit, Life Ignition Tools, use nature's playbook to energize your brain, spark ideas, and ignite action. I didn't say it at the top, though, but just for people to have an understanding of where you operate on a daily basis, the companies you've developed, the technologies we're talking, you guys have developed a tissue glue that can seal holes inside a beating heart. I mean, targeted therapies for Crohn's disease, brain disorders, smart needles that can automatically stop when they reach their target. So some people, if they don't know your background, they might be thinking, we're just kind of having like a motivational conversation or something. But no, you're serious, very, very serious life direction. And you're sharing these general principles in many ways that everyone can use across their lives. So that's really cool stuff. I just want people to understand where you're coming from. So it's great stuff. Hey, Jeff, where's the best place for people to go and find you? Again, the book, Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. But is there a website for them to come check you out if they want to learn more?
Absolutely. So I'm just putting a website together and it should be out in the next few weeks. And it should be my name, jeffkarp.com.
Cool. We can probably talk about this kind of stuff for a long time. And I could actually feel with you, and I don't know if it's because of me or just the conversation, but I can feel as you go farther into a conversation like this, that I can feel you even becoming more comfortable about, okay, I can share this, I can share that. I can feel that in you.
For sure. You got it. Listen, anytime I feel like I start a conversation with someone new, I'm trying to figure it out. I'm like trying to make sure that I'm thinking deeply about things. With all things, that comfort level just starts to, you tend to get there,
I do have some occasional, I will call old guys on this podcast, 80 plus. And I'm not saying all 80 plus don't need time to warm up, but I do have some 80 plus guests that come on that need no warm up time. It's like they are so on fire, so comfortable in their skin, not thinking about anything, don't care about anything. They just want to share. They just want to talk. It's amazing sometimes when I see that happen. So fun stuff.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful thing about life as well, right? Like all the changes and things that we have to look forward to and our ability to get more comfortable as we go and our perspective changes over time. And there's just so many incredible possibilities out there. I'm glad that you shared that. I like that example.
Great stuff, Jeff. Keep me posted on future books.
All right. So nice to speak with you. Thanks again. Really enjoyed this.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.